Tonight, we won't draw lines on a map or recite the points of a compass. Instead, we'll drift into a city where direction itself was treated like weather, something to be read, respected, and sometimes avoided. Here, the Northeast was not just a bearing. It was a shadow with a name, the Kimin, the Demon Gate. Even the wind seemed to turn cautious when you faced that way. Streets bent at strange angles, gates shifted just a little off true north, and beams in old houses leaned as if carpenters had whispered to the wood, "Not there, not tonight." The city learned to move with this hidden current. Travelers paused before thresholds, incense curled in quiet spirals at the unlucky quarter, and a paper talisman brushed against the frame of a door could reroute an entire evening's journey. This was not superstition shouted in fear, but a discipline of small adjustments, shadows folded into habit, caution written into timber and stone. So lower the lights. Let the stillness of this night feel like an unseen map beneath your breathing. And if these quiet detours keep you company, you might stay with us a little longer. Whether awake or half dreaming, the path will wait for you, turning at its own unhurried pace. And if this quiet keeps you company for a while, stay as long as you like. The story will keep unfolding, whether your eyes stay open or drift closed before the last page turns. Beyond the hush of the room, the city waits in its own rhythm, tilting ever so slightly away from one quarter of the compass, as though even stone has learned the art of hesitation. Streets do not argue, they bend. Gates do not forbid. They lean aside with the gentleness of a curtain shifting in the wind. In this way, a direction becomes more than a path, it becomes a presence. Something you feel against your skin before you see it on a map. The maps of old Japan carried a quiet instruction: avoid the Northeast. Not a border, not a wall, just a direction that behaved like a mood, a draft slipping in through the corner of a room. They called it Kimin, the Demon Gate. Streets bent a little when they reached it. Gates angled themselves away as if reconsidering their purpose. Carpenters left subtle bubbles in beams, city plans drew deliberate hesitations, and a whole quarter of the compass became less a place than a feeling. The city itself seemed to glance at its shoes when the needle pointed that way, as though silence was safer than confrontation. At dusk, people spoke of nights that did not forbid anything but gently made movement less appealing. Katatagae, they called it in some places, the turning aside nights. The word sounds like a shrug put into syllables. Not a curfew, not a law, merely a nudge. And yet the wagon slowed. The doors postponed their closing clack. The city shifted mass like a sleeper. Who decided this? No one, exactly, which was the point. The Onmyōji and their calendars mapped the seasons' breaths and put a soft pencil mark when travel ought to avoid the unlucky gate. Neighbors muttered, "Go by the southwest lane tonight," and you could hear the suggestion pass down the block like a broom being set against a wall. It is such a gentle technology of order that it almost counts as furniture. The streets learn to lean. Deliveries wait until morning. A messenger who must go anyway chooses the long route and arrives with the particular relief of someone who has obeyed a rule that never raised its voice. The charm of it, if you like your history soporific, is the instruments that support such a quiet command. There's the ofuda, the paper talisman pasted above a lintel, so light that a moth could carry it if the moth had errands. The ink is not shouting, it is the tone of a clerk. A small compass, sometimes a simple open, sometimes a needle resting in a shallow cup quivers like a shy pointer when the house or road mounts the forbidden angle. Incense curls toward the corner as if the smoke were checking the arrows homeward. None of these is dramatic. They do not ring bells or hoist flags. They work at the speed of a draft under a door. One might imagine the household conversation. We could go, since the moon is good for account keeping. But the Northeast smells off tonight, and the paper says wait. Even the family cat, which understands nothing and everything, chooses the other windowsill. There is also the ritual of Monoimi, the small act of withholding, a day when you do not cross a threshold unless duty picks you up by the collar, a day that is officially unspectacular. Children are delighted because grown-ups say no 3 times in a row. Bureaucrats are content because no is a schedule they can file. I admire the domestic ergonomics of it, the knot of a straw rope at the post, the please do not sign with the politeness of a bow. Doors learn the rhythm of avoidance. The room is the same and somehow new. If you have ever reorganized a drawer purely by not opening it for a week, you understand the method. The soft band is a choreography for stubbing your intention before it toes the line. Even merchants, whose hearts, like their bakuses, prefer the number that goes up, will look at the wind and say, "Very well, tomorrow's profit will still be there for counting." Direction in this Onmyōji view isn't a compass trick. It is an economy. Inns on the safe detour become the accidental winners of the night. The lane at a cleaner angle learns the habits of custom. A city has a balancing act between maps and moods, and the moods win more often than you would think. An official ledger might notice it in the margins. The South Market busier when the Demon Gate sulks. The potter on the bend taking 2 extra orders because carts turn there to rest their squealing axles. A tiny redistribution occurs without speeches or decrees, the way rain distributed coins of puddles down the slope. Caravan masters waited in lanes that did not irritate the sky. The bookkeeper called it hedging. The priest called it prudence. The innkeeper called it Wednesday. Even the high people, those with palanquins and reputations that traveled before them like polite thunder, were sometimes guided by this quiet rule of orientation. Imagine a daimyo column gliding along, lacquered boxes, jingling harness, the human murmur of feet that mean business. The standard lifts, and yet the route bends to avoid the unlucky quadrant. Spectators may not know the term, but they can feel the decision. They read the turn as consideration. The horses do not care, which is a horse's job. The result is unhurried dignity, a virtue difficult to measure by distance. Authority is improved by arriving a little later without admitting delay. If you are looking for the first recorded instance of someone being late because of a compass feeling, it is likely somewhere in a town record framed by a smudge of incense ash. The habit filters into accounts. Even a rice tax takes an extra lane, which may be the most peaceful sentence a ledger can write. Shopkeepers, who count afternoons like beads, find that certain afternoons lengthen when the city agrees not to lean on that northeast corner. The money keeps its jacket on a little longer. It is not much, but markets love not much, because it adds up invisibly. The historian in me wants to build a chart that shows the pulse of Katatagae across a year-little monthly plateaus of let. Esco later. The sleepy part of me prefers a scene. A shop with its bamboo blind half down, a note tucked into the cord, the note's brushstrokes shaped like someone explaining without expecting argument. You could learn more from that note than from 100 decrees. In the archives, the Onmyōji are a calm chorus. They are not shouting sorcerers. They are the city's meteorologists of attitude. They drew "do not point there" on maps the way modern architects draw "no window here" because the sun will glare on a screen. The demon gate is less a demon than a blackout curtain for fortune's draft. Tiny tools enforce it. A ceramic dish of water reflects the skyline and tips ellipses of light toward the clean direction. A brush leans at the ready. A gray cloth waits for polishing the unseen. These artifacts are wonderfully maintenance forward. The ritual is basically housekeeping for the heir's intent. If a museum wants to be proper about it, the label should read, "Implement for not inviting trouble, cotton and habit, 18th century." There is, of course, a shadow inheritance in any rule that concerns where not to look. City plans respect it. Plots and precincts huddle so that the Kimin is masked by something honorable. A temple. A hill of old stones, a tea garden reputed to make even boiled water taste like a decision well made. Streets keep being resurfaced, and yet a junction refuses a right angle in the same old way. I would show you the map, but your eyes are already closing, so it is sufficient to say that the shape of avoidance persists, just like that one corner of your bedsheet keeps refusing to stay tucked. The present renovates, the shadow takes its time. A weary surveyor sighs and draws the bend again because tradition has more patience than ink. While we are here with our fingers trailing along these curled streets, listen to the modern whisper. People shrug and say, nobody bothers with Katatagae now, and then, on certain evenings when the weather is indecisive, they also say, not that way. The sentence we hear out of habit, we don't believe, but is older than unbelief. Convenience will eventually smooth any custom into a superstition, and then sand it further into a superstition-shaped courtesy. Yet directions still have reputations. The window that faces northeast keeps being just a bit drafty no matter how many new frames the contractor installs. The cafe at the safer angle fills first. Real estate agents invent other explanations as they are paid to do. The Onmyōji are not offended. They never needed to be credited. What makes this topic deliciously unimportant at bedtime is how it never asks for a climax. The lucky and unlucky sectors do not duel. They alternate like 2 pages being turned by a drowsy librarian. When a day of monoimi arrives, someone stamps a document later than planned and nothing collapses. The world has so many breaks you never see, and this is one more, a quiet petal near the skirting board. At temples, the talisman paper still flutters, some of it new, some of it tinted by old smoke, and the ink is neither urgent nor faded. It is the voice of a neighbor saying, try tomorrow, with the same authority as a hand flattening a rumpled tablecloth. Things still get done. The rumor of the gate is merely folded into the city's way of saying please. I keep thinking of a small, slightly comic image that shows how well the system works. A courier hat at a sober angle, sandals declaring the budget, reaches a corner marked unlucky on the household calendar. He consults a little charm that is absolutely not a GPS, more like a paperclip that has opinions. He goes left, then left again, then right, and arrives earlier than expected because the longest way is sometimes the least congested. He reports to his master that he took the clean route. The master does not ask for a definition of clean. The report feels complete, like returning a borrowed bowl without engravings. That is the exact flavor of Onmyōji order, a finishedness that is not the result of force, only the comfort of a collective habit. If we stroll back to the market, we can notice how the custom lightly regulated prices. A detour night made the inn on the southeast corner smile into its sleeves. The brewery at the favorable angle counted casks with quiet satisfaction. The charcoal seller muttered that smoke always prefers the bad gate, and therefore business does too. You can't argue with a man who believes his profession has a favorite direction. Official proclamations often sound like someone jiggling a jammed door. Katatagae sounded like setting it aside until it opens by itself. Merchants learned the difference between friction they could sand and friction they could respect. The distinction is not exciting, but it keeps the tea warm. Behind all of this is a calendar that reads like a diary of leaning and straightening. The Onmyōji plotted special days when the vector of mischief implied, do not lead with your northeast foot, which is not a medical instruction, though doctors sometimes agreed. I enjoy the specificity. Real life is rarely so crisp. Here it offered a slice of definite vagueness you could stamp on a notice board. One could plan around it. The future is always an anxious animal. This was a way to feed it very small pellets of certainty. You can feel the city sigh, 100 stoops at once, 100 errands rescheduled to the gentler hour. It must have been satisfying for the clerks, those stewards of all fractional decisions, to have the sky supply policy. There were inevitably exceptions. The courier for a daimyo could not tell a battle that northeast was not advisable today. But even the powerful liked their legitimacy to float on a pond of propriety, and so they performed the long turn when it cost nothing and called it piety when it cost something. That is not hypocrisy, it is a form of civic glue. The audience saw the column lean with the city and felt soothed. Power that bends slightly looks steady as long as the bend is rehearsed. You can almost chart the percentage of compliance by how quickly the crowd resumes talking about grilled skewers. An hour later, the memory is only a path and dust. The next time, the dust is packed a shade firmer, and wagonettes respect it even when the priest has gone home. In diaries, the rule shows up as a margin note. Stayed because the coroner said so. The coroner, like many intangible authorities, doesn't mind being blamed. A daughter writes that she will bring the rice cakes tomorrow because tonight is awkward. An uncle shakes his head fondly and says the same thing for a different reason. Families coordinate around a diagram none of them ever draws. The habit hums like a low instrument beneath the song of daily life. You could reduce it to risk management, and many did, quietly. Avoiding the sharp angle on a windy night is simply good carpentry of the self. If you walk through a modern city and feel a block push you aside for no reason, perhaps remember this. We still keep little superstitions about direction in our pockets, disguised as preferences. One street seems friendlier because the light lands there at a forgiving hour. The bus stop feels luckier because the building opposite refuses to glare. Urban planners might call it microclimate. An Onmyōji would call it not kneeling to the demon gate on a Tuesday. The vocabulary changes. The shrug remains. Most of us make decisions with our ankles long before we consult our heads. Meanwhile, the tools of this practice retain their softness. A compass in its box waits like a polite beetle. The ofuda ages into tawny edges that look like warning only in the way paper warns you not to fold it again. Incense sticks, which have never had an urgent day in their lives, still turn the air into wavy handwriting. A ceramic water dish mirrors a sliver of cloud. A cloth remembers the last dust it lifted. None of these is built to convince. They are built to accompany. Your pillow has the same job. It is the silent consultant that tells you every night not to walk northeast if you can help it. The cities that inherited this pattern, even if they deny it, bear a residual tilt, like a smile remembered by a wall. The corner that refuses to line up with a ruler, the lane that angles because it loves an old tea garden, the shrine that guards the stubborn wedge of unlucky air. Maps absorb these decisions and pretend they are shaped by topography, which is the cartographer's way of yielding gracefully. If a civil engineer drops in today with a steel protractor and a stern lecture, the street will listen and nod and keep its kink anyway. The asphalt remembers the incense. The curb recalls that it once spared a cart a certain gust of fate. Every now and then, a headline pops up about a railway avoiding a direction, or an office tower adjusting its entrance. The explanation given is wind mode, feng shui, traffic throughput, corporate branding, anything but the demon gate, which would be unbudgetable. Nevertheless, the turn appears. You can always tell because the justification is long and the angle is small. That is how modest prohibitions survive modernization, by wearing the suit of good sense. They are not even wrong. A design that works coincidentally with old caution is still a design that works. If you have not yet drifted off, you might be waiting for an ending. There isn't one. The topic is a circle politely refusing to close at the northeast. Customs like this neither rise nor fall. They taper and persist like streets that vanish into gardens. The Onmyōji of record keep entreating with the voice of paperwork, and paperwork, as we know, is the most effective whisper humans have invented. It whispers to markets, to parades, to weddings, to couriers, to cats. It whispers to you, not that way, tonight. And if you turn aside and find a better view, you will say it was for the breeze. And if you keep going anyway, Nothing grand happens, and you simply arrive with a story slightly more interesting than before, which you will not tell because it is almost nothing and perfectly sized for sleep. So the Demon Gate remains mostly a direction, partly a manner, and not at all a crisis. A city leans like a thoughtful head. The talisman paper takes the draft. The compass trembles because that is what needles do. A lane gathers custom without winning a battle. A daimyo column lifts its colors and flows around the bend the way water respects a stone. The modern planner calls it context. The old priest calls it harmony. We call it tonight a good reason to turn the pillow to the cool side face, whichever way is opposite of worry, and let the map continue drawing itself while you are elsewhere, eyes closed following. The clean road that always appears when the room grows quiet. You might not expect a city to have a corner you re-advise to treat like a shy house guest, but that is the tone set by the old Onmyōji when they talked about Cumin, the Demon Gate, which is less a threat than a finicky draft on the northeast side of life. The map in their hands was not a grid but a temperament. Streets straightened until they reached that angle, then developed a polite cough and drifted a finger's width to one side. A window that wanted to be square learned to be almost. A gate that could have faced due north preferred a courteous near north. The result is the kind of pattern you recognize only after the 20th example. A city arranged like a person who keeps shifting on the cushion to avoid a beam of sunlight. If you find this sort of thing soothing you are among friends, and if you're still awake by the time we get to incense and compasses, feel free to subscribe with a kind of relaxed decisiveness favored by administrative spirits. If you drift off before then, I'll take it as compliance with local cosmology. The Onmyōji were not tyrants. They were traffic managers of luck. Their calendars spoke in measured tones. Tonight, turning aside would be respectable. Tomorrow, ordinary routes will resume. No proclamation, no drumbeat, just a brushstroke in the margin and the memory of a proverb. The remarkable part is how everyone knew without being told by anyone in particular. A potter's apprentice planned deliveries with a shrug. A grandmother delayed a visit because the northeast would be testy after sunset. The habit entered architecture by handhold, not by hammer. Kyoto, for example, posted a monastery on the high northeast, as one posts a courteous guard at the draftiest door. Even houses that ignored the advice entirely, there were always a few still placed a plant in that corner as if to busy the luck with watering schedules. You may argue with geography. You rarely argue with a potted fern. The city learned through repetition to treat orientation as etiquette. Not an iron rule, just a custom that puts a wrinkle in the map the way sleep puts a crease in your cheek. You wake up, smooth what needs smoothing, and accept that a trace remains, quietly persuasive and functionally harmless. The apparatus of such a soft band has the pleasant triviality of stationery. There is the ofuda, a paper talisman pasted to a lintel, its characters written in a hand so calm it could teach afternoon to sit. There's a small compass, no bigger than a plum, that keeps its needle like a well-mannered pet, trembling only when brought near the fussy quadrant. There's incense whose smoke turns every room into a seminar on gentle airflow. Put the three together and you have a household meteorology kit for intention. A daughter watches the smoke-lean northeast and decides to sew the loose hem tomorrow. A clerk lets a receipt rest on the blotter, as if the numbers themselves should avoid crossing thresholds. On designated days of monoime, the withhold days, the ritual tightens by doing less. People stay within their gate. Grocers stack apples, but do not step out to weigh anyone's impatience. A rope with a knot closes a path, not because it must, but because it wants to. I appreciate the minimalism, a ceremony performed by the decision not to perform. Children love it because grown-ups say no 3 times. Adults love it because no is a schedule you can plan around. Meanwhile, there is housekeeping to the cosmology. A ceramic water dish mirrors the ceiling and tells the air what to do, which is exactly as effective as it sounds, and therefore perfect for humans, who prefer rituals with average power and infinite repeatability. Salt in a saucer keeps a corner company like a polite guard dog that never barks. A gray cloth waits to polish the invisible. Somewhere a priest copies the date by lamplight and draws a small, stubborn stroke beside it, the mark that turns bustle into pause without staging a debate. Nothing in this toolkit is theatrical. None of it would startle a cat. That is the elegance. This is not a religion of spectacles, but of reminders. The spiritual equivalent of a fridge magnet quietly instructing you not to forget your umbrella. When money meets direction, the map becomes a ledger. On nights when Katatagae, the turning aside applies, inns along the cleaner detour soften their voices and set out an extra pot for stew. A lane that normally registers as merely convenient becomes respectable. Travelers treat it like a crisp sheet, tucked square. The result is a tiny redistribution of coin that is, to a historian, the economic version of rainfall, pattern without panic. A courier notes, chose the fortunate way, and submits the notation as if it were mileage. Judges reschedule a hearing because the defendant must cross the awkward angle to reach the court. The clerk writes, adjourned for reasons of error, which is honest enough. Even in more muscular contexts, the daimyo procession, lacquered and jingling, this quiet compass has influence. The column keeps its dignity by bending, not by bullying the axis of the day. The musicians do not alter their rhythm. The bearers simply lean into the turn with the kind of choreography that looks like grace in slow motion. Crowds rate the adjustment as courtesy. Reputation, which dislikes noise, improves by a fraction. I am fond of the merchant's arithmetic here. A brewer near the safe angle usually sells 5 casks. On a detour night, he sells 6 and says nothing, because gloating is bad for foam. A tea house on the wrong edge tells stories a little longer to disguise the empty chairs and discovers, almost by accident, a new kind of loyalty. The city's pacemaker ticks with a direction-sensitive beat. Markets do not announce that they have accepted the Onmyōji's advice. They just adjust their opening hand, like a card player respecting a table superstition because it costs nothing and the game flows better. Somewhere a logbook tallies, traffic buoyant via South Lane, and adds a quiet checkmark that means everyone already knows why. It is the world's gentlest policy instrument, drawn with a brush that never had to be cleaned urgently. What persists from all this is the angle itself, a wedge of air that resists being flattened by modernization. Even now, planners arrive with steel protractors and excellent intentions. They redraw an intersection to 90 clean degrees and discover that the shops turn their awnings to invent a bend anyway. The corner that refuses to move is less geology than memory. A temple still guards the troublesome quarter of a town, even if the town pretends to have outgrown its superstitions. Real estate brochures explain a building's entrance as optimized for prevailing breezes, which is a professional phrase meaning not on the northeast because why argue? People say, we don't pay attention to Katatagae anymore, and then, without noticing, say, let's go the other way tonight. The rule has become etiquette. Etiquette has become habit. Habit has become design. There is a soft inheritance here. Precincts that behave like elders, a lane that is unwilling to glare, and a dress that prefers being found from the left. If you ask for an official statement, you will be given terms like microclimate, soundscape, and sightline, which are true and also politely synonymous with we heard the old story and adjusted the door. Every technology collaborates. A GPS, when set to fastest, sometimes reproduces the detour because the math of traffic accidentally agrees with the math of worry. If you want a modern footnote, try this. There are construction crews who, without saying so, schedule the Northeast work on days when the calendar is indifferent because it makes the site feel cooperative. Their foremen will call it logistics. The elders will call it listening. The most relaxing part of this whole subject, and therefore the best for sleep, is how little it demands of you. Kaimen is a direction you need not face. The Onmyōji are administrators you need not meet. The customs are pauses you can keep in your pocket like a train ticket you might need later. As a rule set, it is allergic to confrontation. If you ignore it, you are merely ordinary. If you follow it, you are quietly in tune with the civic lullaby. The talisman on the lintel keeps its own counsel either way. The compass needle trembles because that is what needles were built to do. Incense writes dusky, useless calligraphy and is applauded for the effort. Manwemi waits for you to discover that not crossing a threshold can be an accomplishment. Markets adjust. Parades tilt. Houses exhale softly through the lucky windows and draw their curtains on the other side a little earlier, as if tucking the city in. And you, without needing to remember any of the vocabulary, will find your pillow and turn away from the northeast as naturally as a cat selects the warmer corner of a room. If you're still with me, thank you. If you are already drifting, that is acceptable compliance. The map can finish orienting itself while you rest. You might not expect a city to have a direction it treats like a shy animal, but that is how old map makers in robes described the northeast Kimon, the demon gate that is more draft than danger. The compass on their table did not scold. It murmured. Streets that should have run straight learned to lean a finger as width when they neared that quarrelsome edge. Gates considered facing north, then cleared their throats and faced almost north. A window that wanted to square itself remembered manners and blinked sideways. No law appeared, only the sort of suggestion that feels like weather. An angle in the air that people notice the way you notice a rug snap when you smooth your hand with, not against. And then came the nightly advisories, Katatagae, the turning aside nights recorded in a clerk's neat hand with ink that dried as slowly as dusk. The entry did not threaten. It read like a recipe note. Avoid the northeast tonight if convenient. Take the prosperous way round if not inconvenient. The city obeyed because the instructions sounded like common sense borrowed from the wind. If you are still awake by the time I get to the small ceramic dish that tells Smoke which way to think, feel free to subscribe to this channel or don't. Compliance in this subject is famously gentle. The purpose is not to excite you. It is to file down the edge of attention until it becomes smooth enough to slide across. Once you understand that orientation can be etiquette, the map stops looking like a grid and starts looking like a set of table manners. A city that swears by corners learns to treat one corner differently, and it whispers its preference into everything. The square of a household becomes a lopsided quilt stitched beautiful because it refuses to argue. Even those who ignored the custom rarely contradicted it loudly. A lord built his gate on the northeast because he could, and people admired the audacity the way you admire a cat who sits on the rulebook. But they still stepped around the threshold with a small ceremony of the foot, the way one avoids creaking a stair in a sleeping house. On paper, the advice is so minor it looks like triviality performing in miniature. In practice, it rearranges an afternoon. A messenger plans 2 streets to the south and 1 to the east, not because the world will end in the northeast, but because the soup will arrive warmer if carried elsewhere. The neat magic is that everyone knows. No proclamations are shouted. There's only this very slight turn in the spoken map, like a dialect held in the jaw. The city becomes a classroom where air teaches, and the lesson is, better to glide than collide. It's the kind of rule that makes people more polite toward chairs. In this environment, tools have the serenity of stationery. The Ofuda paper talismans hang on lintels, their brushwork straight-backed and calm, like a librarian who can shush a thunderstorm with a look. A thumb-length compass sits in a palm, and its needle trembles as if embarrassed to point to directly. Incense is brought out not to perfume the divine, but to reveal the domestic, that trick of thin, readable smoke, showing where the air believes north to be. The trio of paper, magnet, and curl of gray makes a small weather station for luck. Someone lights a stick and watches the line tilt toward the northeast corner and thinks, yes, of course, not today. This is the sort of science that agrees with superstition by accident. It's also very tidy. The tools require the kind of maintenance a sleepy person can manage: dusting, cautious folding, a new box of matches when the drawer declares itself empty. When Onmyōji arrives, the day of withholding, these implements become an orchestra that plays silence. The rule is simple: do not begin, do not bring in. Do not cross a threshold unless duty and kindness insist. Children adore the repeatability of no, said 3 pleasant times, and adults appreciate that no is a schedule they can make tea around. A rope with a knot across a path is sufficient ceremony. A shallow ceramic dish filled with water mirrors the ceiling and pretends to instruct the air. The air pretends to listen. On such days, houses practice staying inside themselves and discover, as many have, that staying in is a hobby that rewards practice. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point and the comfort. Commerce, which looks impatient from the outside, takes to the system as water takes to a ladle. On turning aside nights, the inns and tea houses along the cleaner detour find their lamps burning a polite fraction longer. The baker in the favorable street sells the 6th loaf and writes nothing boastful on the wall. The shop that sits in the teased corner closes one curtain earlier, but tells stories a bit longer to customers who happen to arrive before dusk, inventing a format we might now call extended browsing. Couriers note Cho's prosperous way on their receipts, a phrase that sounds like optimism's version of a mileage log. Tax collectors notice patterns without making eye contact with the reasoning. A damo's procession, lacquer glinting like a well-argued sentence, honors the night's angle by bending, not blustering. The bearers lean as one, the drums do not hurry, and the crowd witnesses an expensive curve executed as if it had always been part of the choreography. It becomes in the ledger an unremarkable adjustment and, in memory, an example of dignity that made walking the long way fashionable for exactly one evening. Meanwhile, the city's invisible accounts settle. Reputations, those anxious birds, perch more calmly on shop signs in the detour lane, because praise arrives by habit and complaint arrives only when it has nothing better to do. The grand discovery is that policy administered by rumor can distribute money as gently as a good rainfall, not equally, but with the kind of slant that makes sense to the grasses involved. The hidden economy of direction also arranges mercy with a pencil, not a trumpet. Court days slide across the week, the way a bead slides across string. A magistrate is unavailable today, not because his calendar is crowded, but because his route would cross the fussy corner, and the fussy corner prefers unimportant footsteps. Anyone who has misplaced energy can't object. No one does. The jailer replaces a hearing with a bowl of barley and a promise of tomorrow. Caravans leaving the city choose the fortunate gate and discover that the fortunate gate, by mysterious coincidence, is also the gate with flatter stones. A minstrel adds a verse about the Northeast being a place where stories back up and need to be escorted carefully. The innkeeper in the awkward quadrant finds a benefit too. A night with fewer strangers is a night when she can darn the bedding and teach her nephew whichever numbers he has avoided all week. Even accounts that look harsh become quiet. A tax officer cannot levy what the angle does not permit him to collect. He writes "forborne by the wind" in the margin, and the phrase moves along the desks like a mild joke that nobody laughs at and everybody repeats. Power in this scheme is a broom that moves dust around gently until it settles into patterns you can live with. Some customs travel well through time because they are hard to argue with and harder to notice while you're re-arguing. The corner that refuses to move is one of them. Cities repave, redraw, and rehearse modernity. The Northeast persists like a crease in the pocket of a favorite coat. Surveyors stand with their elegant tripods and insist on 90 degrees. The shop fronts respond by turning their planters in a way that restores the old bend on the ground, if not on the blueprints. A temple sits at the bad angle like a friendly paperweight holding down a page. The city keeps trying to turn too quickly. Realtors describe entrances as oriented for prevailing breezes, which is a modern way to say, we heard what our grandparents whispered. Even navigation apps become accomplices. The algorithm, indifferent to spirits, computes traffic flows and occasionally suggests the same detour that Onmyōji recommended, because math and manners sometimes hold hands. Renovation crews quietly schedule northeast tasks for indifferent days, because the cranes feel less argumentative then. The foreman calls it logistics. The elder who brings tea calls it luck. The result is an urban palimpsest where asphalt writes over ink, and the ink, patient as always, sinks in and writes back through the asphalt. By now you may be wondering what happens if someone ignores all of this and strides through the northeast on a forbidden night carrying a large basket of decisions. The answer is delightfully uneventful. They arrive, winded or not, the basket tilts. A dog barks in a key of minor disapproval. Nothing appears on fire. Later, at supper, their aunt says, "Oh?" in a tone that covers both concern and recipe selection. The person sleeps badly because there was a knot in the mattress, not because the stars objected. The city's genius is this ladder of consequence, etiquette at the top, weather on the rung below, and social memory holding the ladder steady. You can defy etiquette, the weather can make you reconsider. Social memory will lend you a cushion next time and recommend a better pillow. Building the habit into the map made it hard to forget and unnecessary to enforce. That is the secret, if a secret can be written on every corner and still require whispering. I like to imagine an archivist of angles, a patient person who's spent a lifetime collecting notes that say almost nothing. Incense leaned, gate avoided, procession curved, trial delayed until tomorrow because tomorrow wished to be helpful. Their shelves would look like a museum of gentle refusal. They could give tours that last precisely the length of a candle. A modern planner might attend and scribble user experience of east wind, high as if scoring a product. Meanwhile, the living city continues. A grandmother moves her plant because light has shifted. A convenience store props its door in a way that makes the bell ring once fewer times an hour. A cyclist coasts the long way and discovers a bakery that sells the second best custard in the ward, which, by the quiet hierarchy of dessert, is the one you visit repeatedly. Every small decision thickens the habit until it is history. At no point does someone declare victory. The Onmyōji would approve of the lack of applause. The modern whisper is almost indistinguishable from a shrug. City governments publish guidelines about airflow and heat islands, soundscapes and sightlines, and somewhere inside those crisp pages is the old instruction folded like a lucky charm. Do not build impatience into the wind. Let streets that want to curve, curve. Accept the long way when it is taught with calm. A new office tower rotates its entrance 10 degrees and calls it sustainability. The security guard calls it less maddening when the afternoon gales push. The buses turn earlier and their timetables improve, because the drivers are less tired at explaining weather to passengers. Private homes angle their foyers so that shoes remember which way to point, and family arguments take one extra breath before they begin. It is not magic. It is the relief of practices that never ask you to believe, only to cooperate. If you have drifted a little, that too is cooperation. This topic prefers listeners who lean away from the bright edge, as the streets do, and choose the nearly right angle that lets the mind stop catching. The Demon Gate, so-called, is just a careful corner. Katatagae's nights are merely evenings that recommend being slightly better at waiting. The Ofuda is paper, the compass is a nervous pet. Incense is a visible yawn, markets settle like dust. Processions curve like etiquette. The stubborn corner becomes an heirloom that weighs exactly as much as it needs to in order to keep the page from flipping in a draft. Any still with me or already asleep are part of the map now, another gentle detour drawn in pencil, perfectly adequate, pleasantly avoidant, and exactly on time for tomorrow, when the angle will feel generous and the city will agree that you chose well by choosing the softest way around. You might not expect a direction to keep an appointment book, but in certain old cities, the Northeast carried a little notebook of evenings when it politely asked to be avoided. The request never raised its voice. It arrived as a marginal note in a calendar written in a hand, so tidy that even the ink seemed to be sitting up straight, reminding people that tonight was a turning aside night, a cut-edge evening for the Kimin, the demon's gate that behaved less like a gate and more like a draft that knew where it lived. Doors didn't slam, they just thought better of themselves. A messenger who would normally walk as the crow flies remembered, with the punctuality of tea water at a simmer, that crows can be excused from urban planning. If you are still awake when I reach the part about the incense dish that negotiates with wind, feel free to subscribe or don't. The rule we're discussing has no enforcement section and would be horrified if it did. The habit was not superstition dressed as law. It was etiquette written onto stone by repetition. A corner that everyone believed to be touchy received the kind of courtesy you grant to a chair with a loose leg. You never sit on it in a hurry. Streets kept their right angles on paper and then slid, at the last moment, into something more conversational. Carpenters blamed their planes. Surveyors blamed their string. Grandmothers blamed the way certain breezes refused to mind their own business. In drawing rooms, people didn't say, "Never use the Northeast after dark," because that sounded dramatic, and drama never sold well in houses built of wood. They said, perhaps the other way tonight, and everyone recognized the small, shared humor that sits in the pocket of such a sentence. Windows were not barred, only angled. Gates were not shut, only discouraged. The city's face turned fractionally, like someone listening with one ear. A priest could produce a formula for the weeks between winter's back and spring's front, and it would look like a recipe you could make without writing it down. Add 3 unpromising afternoons to the end of the month. Subtract the impatient festival. Stir in 1 day of mean weather. Taste. If the air tastes like iron, postpone your errands. Shopkeepers could recite the schedule, but preferred the flavor method. When the wind off the river folded the banners on the tea house porch, when the paper lanterns quivered before being lit, when dogs looked briefly toward the northeast while pretending to investigate other matters, then you put the broom across the sill at an angle and called the day content. This was the city's genius. The rule looked like weather, and weather looked like common sense. People developed a quiet talent for obedience. The tools were modest enough to fit on a tray. A square of paper cut from a larger square, handwriting curling like steam. A pen that liked one metal basin more than any other and seemed to remember this preference at all times. A stick of incense that, once burning, made the air visible for a while and encouraged thoughts to move at the speed of smoke. The article that actually enforced the rule was a knot in a straw rope hung across a lane, the kind of sign children respect immediately and adults respect eventually. An ant would pass under such a rope and feel taller the way one does after walking through a doorway that is slightly too low. Later, she would tell her niece we walked around tonight, and the niece would say, of course, as if she had already known. The ofuda on a doorframe didn't glare at violators. It merely made them aware that they had been seen by paper, which is worse. Some days were monoimi days of withholding, when you didn't bring in, didn't send out, and didn't cross the threshold unless kindness insisted. The city acquired a wonderful stillness on those days, not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of a library deciding to nap while you rereading in it. Couriers knew the trick of adding one night's rest to a message without subtracting its meaning. A magistrate became unavoidably absent with such regularity that the clerks could draw a little plum blossom to indicate the reason, and no one thought the less of the court for letting weather and wisdom adjudicate minor matters. Even the fish vendors conceded the logic fish disapprove of delays but approve of orderly streets, and so they changed their shouts to an interrogative, a question that meant, "Do you really need this right now?" Most of the time the answer was, with gratitude, not especially. Markets, which appear to be allergic to philosophy, adapted with the agility of a cat claiming it meant to go that way all along. Inns along the recommended detour put on an extra pot and only half filled the cups, a polite way of letting the evening linger without letting it gallop. The unlucky corners establishments learned to treat Katatagae as a spa day for floors. Mats were taken out and beaten with calm ferocity. Drawers were counted. The ledger was reconciled to the degree ledgers can be. There was a thrift in all this that nobody bothered to name. Revenue arrived less abruptly. Expenses learned to wait their turn. In the hidden columns where reputations are tallied, the detour street grew a thin smile. If the tax office looked closely at its own numbers, it could have seen the shiver of the Northeast as influence running through them like a taut thread. But tax offices prefer their explanations to arrive in a cart with a stamp, and the wind brings neither. Even ceremonies, those stubborn machines bent without looking as if they had. A daimyo's train, lacquer shining as if polished by patience itself, took a long way with the serenity of a river that has already seen the sea. Spectators appreciated the spectacle of obedience disguised as grace. A very tall retainer learned to keep his standard tilted so that the crest would not quarrel with the angle of the street. After 3 such nights, he carried it that way regardless, and nobody told him. In an era of statements carved into tablets, the preferred statement was a nod. City logic said, if the map asks us softly, why attempt to shout back? People discovered that detours are slower in fewer ways than you expect. The feet moved a little more. The heart moved a little less. Inside houses, the angle reached the domestic level, which is where all policies either break or become furniture. Kitchens face southeast because rice likes to know the morning. Bedrooms learn to tuck into the west because sleep is a traveler that arrives over land, not over water. Grandfathers observed these choices and attributed them to taste. Grandmothers observed the grandfathers and attributed them to luck, which is taste that has been correct for a very long time. Sliding doors made those agreeable chuffs and sighs that carpenters strive to capture. If you ever heard a door agree with you, you know the sound, and when the Northeast sulked, the doors could be persuaded to stay put. The household shrine paid no measurable attention. It had seen worse and made a living of it. The rule's greatest triumph may have been its effect on punctuality. If a road is forbidden, one leaves earlier, but not very. That in-between minute, the one you spend deciding whether to tie your sash again because the bow looks overconfident, became the city's favorite minute. It had the softness of spare change in a pocket. People used it to check the stove, to remember the handkerchief they always forget, to say one more foolishly tender thing to a child. When a clerk said, "I will arrive toward the 10th bell with margins," he meant he would walk around the corner that didn't like him and enjoy the part where the river shows its back to the houses. As productivity tips go, the Northeast produced better results by doing nothing than a great many modern memos produced by doing a lot. There were inevitably professionals of direction, Onmyōji, readers of Time's weather who treated calendars like instruments that needed regular tuning. They had an unshowy confidence, as if the sky had been explaining itself to them for so long that speech was unnecessary. People came to them not for thunderous pronouncements, but for advice that saved shoe leather. You could ask, is tomorrow favorable for opening the new shutters, and be told. Tomorrow asks to be listened to, the day after asks to be believed, and you would nod as if you had known all along which was which. The Onmyōji had strong wrists from writing small, reliable characters on silk. They envied no one, and were envied only by people who admired tranquility in others, and then hurried away to ruin their own. The detour knights also invented their own commerce. A girl with clean handwriting earned coins copying the list of "avoid this evening" streets and pinning the copy to the inn counter with a decorative toothpick. A boy rented umbrellas that were entirely unnecessary but made detours feel official. One enterprising aunt taught a class in long-way lunch packing, which turned out to be putting the sweet thing at the exact center of the bundle so that the traveler reached it only when halfway around. Even the crows, who were not consulted, pivoted slightly in their flight on Katatagae evenings, perhaps from respect, perhaps to mock. Birds have complicated relationships with courtesy. All of this would have been quaint if it had remained in the era of scraped sandals and inkstones. But the corner that doesn't move has an admirable talent for survival. Plans changed. Asphalt arrived like a boast. The corner nodded. Survey data squared the streets. The buses rounded them again. The corner pretended not to notice, and then noticed for centuries. Urban ministries publish reports about airflow, about heat stubbornly pooling in east-facing cavities, about the way old lanes guided summer winds like kind rivers. A few engineers, after reading these papers with the conscientious skepticism engineers carry like a medal, looked at the old maps and had the rare joy of discovering their grandmothers were correct. A new high-rise rotated its entrance just enough that lunchtime crowds ceased to roll like marbles and began to flow like outcomes. The developer called it pedestrian optimization. The night watchman called it fewer curses when the winter gusts sneak up. People who move to the city from other places learn the rule, the way you learn not to step on a particular squeak in your apartment floor. You are not told. You simply agree to something without understanding that you have agreed. One day you find yourself turning left and then right, and only later notice the northeast staring at you like a photograph. You meant to hang straight. The rule had no loyalty of. It had a tone. Children asked why and were told, because your shoes keep their promises better that way. Children accepted this, as they accept the idea that noodles can be too cheerful to eat before the fifth stir. Shipments, which normally enjoy the shortest line between two cradles, grew philosophical. A rice barge pressed against the favorable bank and made excellent time slipping past warehouses, with their slatted eyelids half-drawn. Paper-bound records in town halls sprouted agreeable phrases that sound like poems because they were brought by the long path, turned by the good wind, delayed by the well-meaning compass. A magistrate made a stamp that read "Tomorrow," blue ink that meant leniency but also logistics. It became the most popular piece of office equipment since the string for measuring witnesses' honesty. At the level of gossip, a municipal utility in its own right, the Kimin produced small, reusable stories, never large, always portable. A woman met her husband by walking the long way and greeting a neighbor she would have missed. However, in the story, they exchanged no glances worth reporting and simply admired the weather together and later got married. Because marriages occur in the same way rice cooks, once begun gently. A merchant avoided the northeast door on a particular hour and thereby avoided a client who was not yet ready to negotiate. The deal became possible a week later, mostly because tempers are timepieces with terrible springs. A carpenter saved a roof tile by cutting it with the grain the angle suggested. These are not epics. They are the stories that fill a kitchen with the sense that the world has decided to be reasonable for a change. There is a magnetism to such long habits. You can see it in how people point when giving directions, how their hands, even now, make that small, apologetic curve, as if bowing on your behalf. You can see it in the way festival parades pretend to be chaos while moving like a compass needle on good behavior. You can see it in the soft doubt that enters a conversation when someone proposes building something that stares down the northeast as if daring it to blink. The council's minutes will show votes, and votes will sound like decisions, but it will be the absence of arguments, the way a proposal passes without acquiring enemies, that tells you obeyed the quarter. And if someone insists on defiance, if a builder absorbs too many pamphlets and constructs a lobby that reaches toward the northeast with the posture of a Golgotha, handshake at a deafening concert, then the city does what cities do best. It waits. The wind will lean. The doors will complain. The umbrella stands will form a union and droop together. The manager will declare, one rainy month, that it is more convenient to enter from the other side. The plan will be folded gently and repurposed as a mouse pad. The corner will remain. Nobody will say, I told you so. It is not that kind of wisdom. The modern whisper carries the same grammar. Phone maps route people along streets that function like riverbanks because the algorithms prefer success, and success has discovered it lives to the west of stubbornness. Office towers hang their revolving doors as if letting the building exhale through a better nostril. A bicycle lane detours around an older house because the older house in a previous life detoured around something even older. The cyclist senses compliance in the paint. Weather apps warn of gusts from the river, and pedestrians wearing coats that think highly of themselves choose the block with kinder eddies. None of this appears at first glance to involve demons or gates. It looks like people being sensible. This is how old spells become daily chores. By the time we reach the incense dish, the little saucer of water where a stick stands, and the smoke leans as if consulting a dictionary, you will be ready for its quiet comedy. Someone puts it on a step. The smoke behaves for a few minutes, like an opinion shared by friends who are shy in crowds. The breeze considers it and answers with a little tilt of its own. A decision is reached that affects nothing and therefore reshapes the day. People who notice are reassured. People who don't notice are protected. The smoke keeps no score. You could sit beside it for an hour and feel time politely slow, and the way buses slow when they see a driver from the same depot. If you have drifted off during any of this, the rule will have done you a professional courtesy. It has always been a policy in favor of slightly longer walks, slightly cooler tempers, slightly quieter streets, slightly later verdicts, and slightly better nights of sleep. It never promised salvation from weather or mischance. It offered a method for cooperating with both. The city kept it because it was the sort of advice a city can love, almost invisible, endlessly repeatable, and incapable of scolding. The Northeast remains where it always has, the corner that doesn't move, attended by talismans that look like bookmarks and compasses that think before pointing and smoke that writes in cursive on air. The map continues to bow by a degree to the most persuasive breeze. And tomorrow, when you leave the house, you will find yourself turning left and then right and then wondering why the day has already decided to like you. You might not expect a city to keep its time in a locked office, yet Rome did, and the key was a stylus. On the Capitol line, men with tidy handwriting and an impressive sense of when to pause for effect kept the calendar like librarians who had learned their shelves by touch. They did not move the sun. They moved days, which turned out to be almost the same for everyone whose life depended on when debts fell due or when a court convened. The boards on which they wrote were not mystical. They were practical planks, painted white, where tomorrow could be added with a calm stroke, and yesterday could be stretched just wide enough to fit a festival. Priests in good sandals traced market days, court days, and the inconveniently tempting days when contracts had to rest. A citizen who wanted certainty looked up at a wall and read it, the way we look at a timetable in a sleepy airport and accept that the plane will depart at the time the board prefers. If you're still awake by the time I mention the bonus month that behaves like a polite guest, who insists on washing the dishes, feel free to subscribe or not. The calendar will not take it personally. It has space for your decision either way. Between February and March lived an extra door, and the priests who were very much in favor of doors opened it when they were ready. The doorway had a name, Mercedonius, which sounded like a gentleman who kept notes on parchment and apologized for existing. It was most often invited in winter, when the old lunar schedule and the comparatively stubborn solar year drifted apart, like two people walking down a street who began discussing different buildings. The pontiff stretched the year with an extra month when it suited astronomy, and also when it suited administration. Trials moved with the tide of days. Rents could be nudged like chess pieces. Magistrates enjoyed terms that conveniently grew or shrank according to celestial courtesy. The remarkable thing is how quiet it all felt. Rome was noisy about most things, but the calendar's edits arrived with librarian volume. A debt collector did not shout at the sky. He simply noted a new date on his wax tablet with all the emotion of a baker scoring loaves. The city's traffic flowed as if guided by invisible ropes, and one of those ropes was a priest's clean line dividing today from not yet, ordinary. Romans cooperated with endearing practicality. Vendors arranged their stalls by the rhythm of nundine, the 8-day market cycle that marched through the month like a dignified parade no one could remember organizing. A farmer who walked in from the hinterland timed his oranges, or more accurately his garum jars and wool, to the sequence of letters chalked in a public place. When the intercalary month was declared, the sequence adjusted with a soft click. He sighed, shrugged, and forgot to be surprised. The courts did as courts do, change the hearing to the first favorable day that is not a festival. Avoid the one that honors a deity who prefers silence, and leave the rest to advocates who never met a postponement they didn't like. Even weddings learned to step carefully. A bride who wanted an auspicious morning learned to listen for the difference between temple bells meant for gods and the small announcement that someone had added a week to keep the moon honest. The city was a practical astronomer. It looked up, took notes, and then looked down to see if the fishmonger's calendar agreed. Mostly it did. There was politics in the chalk dust. If a consul wished his allies to enjoy a few extra days of authority, the moon could be persuaded to wait politely behind a cloud. If a rival's trial appeared inconveniently imminent, the year lengthened with all the naturalness of a river taking the long bend around a sandbar. Rome did not call this cheating. It called it administration. Everyone could read the boards. Everyone could argue. The priests smiled and pointed at the sky. Meanwhile, merchants counted interest by the temple's timetable and adopted with ease. That would impress a modern payroll office. You might say the city learned to walk with one foot in astronomy and one in bureaucracy, which is a slow, steady gait well suited to stone streets. From the outside, it all looked fixed those monumental months. It was public announcements, but inside there was a hinge, and it creaked softly in winter. Adding days was less a ritual than a craft, like joining two planks so neatly that water fails to find the seam. The intercalary month was not flashy. It lived near February, taking a few days hostage and then returning them with interest. Roman scribes wrote it in as if they were balancing household accounts and found a small coin under a cushion. A herald walked to a step and announced the decision in a voice just loud enough to reach the edge of the square. Not a decibel more. Markets shifted like school children told gently to move up one desk. Contracts shrugged and changed a line. The timekeepers, being practical, marked the new sequence of fasti and nefasti, the days open to public business and the days close to it, so that nobody could claim surprise. Nothing in the city moves as quietly as an extra day. It sits down, looks decent, and then insists with affable stubbornness that you treat it as a proper day with a morning and an afternoon and a respectful little lunch. Rome had learned from its own building projects. The secret of construction is the confidence with which you pretend the added piece was always intended. Of course, these adjustments left fingerprints. Tax farmers recognized that an elongated year could be a kind of windfall, provided the public didn't count too closely. Interest, like ivy, enjoys any surface that lasts longer. Land leases drifted along with the priest's styluses, which encouraged creative interpretations of due dates. To keep such creativity within the boundaries of civility, there were customary hedges. 2 lawyers stood at a doorway and agreed that an intercalation was a divine matter and therefore, inconveniently, not a legal one. The bills came when they came. If you need a modern analogy, think of the extra hour you win on the night the clocks change, and how you spend it immediately on nothing. Rome spent extra months the same way, on the practical satisfaction of meetings that suddenly fit. The comedy was gentle. A senator scolded a clerk for delivering a letter on the wrong day, only to be reminded the day had changed its name. The senator, who had once voted to change it, forgave the universe and everyone in it. Over time, the hinge squeaked louder. Political men discovered that a compliant calendar could sway a voting bloc in ways that aqueducts and oratories sometimes could not. Elections moved like furniture in a room that looks large until you start arranging it. For an ambitious pontifex, it was tempting to prefer a year that cooperated with allies and discouraged enemies with weather, darkness, or a suspicious festival. The public increasingly tied inconvenience to the office that wielded the stylus. You can guess how Rome reacted. It made jokes. Comedians in the forum suggested that if you bribed the moon, it would wax during the speeches of your friends and wane during audits. Someone likely sold amulets promising protection against surprise months. But under the jokes grew a useful irritation, the sort that changes systems. Officers fresh from campaign wanted a calendar that didn't shuffle under their feet like a deck of slightly damp cards. Then came a general who had the practical impatience of all generals and the benefit of astronomers from Alexandria who kept notebooks. So precise they might as well have been, measuring the growth of olive trees with a ruler. Julius Caesar's sweep through the calendar behaved not like a revolution, but like badly needed house cleaning. He did not abolish feast days. Rome would have sulked for decades. He simply carried the whole contraption into the courtyard, measured it against the sun, and reassembled it with links that matched. Days stopped slipping like coins through a frayed purse. The intercalary month, that gentle guest, was retired with honors and a generous pension. What the city gained was not excitement, but reliability. Bakers could plan their flour. Scribes could sharpen their styluses on a schedule that felt less like strategy and more like climate. Somewhere a fishmonger sighed in relief, and somewhere a lawyer wept because postponements would now require talent rather than calendar weather. This reset had its own quiet drama. In order to knock the year into alignment, the authorities extended a particular year to a length that made everyone smile, and then keep smiling, because complaining took too long. The city endured, as cities do, by treating absurdity like weather. People married when the priest said the month was ready. Rents fell due when the schedule, now on a strict solar diet, announced that they must. Time, which had always been a local ordinance, became a little more universal. You could visit a friend in a far province and be reasonably sure your festival memories matched. If you want a picture, imagine a household hanging a new set of curtains that finally reached the floor. Nobody applauds curtains. They simply say, yes, that is better, and go on stirring the pot. What survived after Caesar reseated the furniture were the small domestic traditions. Superstition did not argue with astronomy. It found new chairs. A mother still advised her daughter to avoid certain days for cutting hair, not because the moon demanded it, but because the mother's mother's mother had found such days restful. and rest agrees with hair. Shopkeepers continued to close on convenient afternoons, which now corresponded more neatly to civic lists. Farmers still watched the sky with animal confidence and improved yields by trusting the new regularity. The most endearing survivor was the Roman affection for well-posted information. Walls told the time as faithfully as clocks. A boy could grow up by counting how many times the letters for market day came around and measuring his own height against announcements. When you tie your present to a schedule written large, your life acquires the serenity of paperwork well filed. The empire carried its tidy year outward the way people carry their grandmother's recipe, with a righteous belief that everyone will prefer it once they try it. Provinces grumbled politely and adopted the habit. Monasteries, centuries later, made a vocation of the calendar. They rang bells with patient accuracy until time itself learned the route across the fields. When adjustments returned small ones, so small they fit into the mathematics of a pope who liked arithmetic, the city on the Tiber was long past caring who held the stylus. The year had become a citizen of more places than the Forum. Still, in archives and in the corners of old houses, you can sense the earlier softness, the once movable seam. The memory lingers that time used to be something you can move with a meeting and a convincingly public voice, if you prefer your curiosities tiny. There's the matter of the market cycle, which never quite lost its village gait. Even when months settled down, the old 8-day rhythm kept the city's breath from becoming too precise. It is difficult to feel bullied by a calendar that remembers a farmer 5 days away. City dwellers adjusted as kindly as possible. A court never convened on a day meant for transactions if it could help it, not because law feared barley, but because a judge who annoys fish sellers invites a permanent smell to follow him home. The humor stayed dry. Satirists imagined a universe in which the gods themselves checked the bulletin board before deciding to hurl a thunderbolt. A famous orator was said to schedule his speeches not against rivals, but against the cheese market, because cheese, unlike rivals, cannot be heckled into silence. And then there were the personal calendars, kept in heads rather than on marble. A shopkeeper's year contained the day on which a certain customer always claimed to have no small coins. A porter's month included the morning he didn't have to carry amphorae because an edict forbade traffic. A midwife's week had a corner that faced east because many babies in that alley had the courtesy to arrive at dawn. The official calendar had to stand upright in a public place. The private one sprawled on a kitchen table, coffee stains and all. The miracle is that the two overlapped most of the time. When they did not, the pontiffs would point at the sky, and the kitchen shrugged, and Rome continued. This is not a story of control. It is a story of accommodation, an art at which cities never stop practicing. The office of time remains, mostly invisible in our own quiet machinery. We argue about daylight saving with the passion Romans reserved for olive oil, then accept the result because Monday insists. We print calendars with holidays color-coded, as if we were chalking fasty and nefasty with better inks. Software packages nudge meetings across months with a single click, which is exactly what a pontiff did, minus the sandals. And yes, we still discover the occasional year that needs a small kindness, an extra day at the end of February, added with a librarian's voice and a mathematician's smile. No one demands a parade. We pour coffee on the 29th and proceed to treat it like a proper day, with a morning and an afternoon and a respectful little lunch. If you have drifted toward sleep, somewhere between Mercedonius and Cheese Day, the experiment has succeeded. The Romans perfected a tranquil thrill, that a city could edit time without alarming its citizens. Their priests did not own the sun. They owned a stylus and a talent for making chalk feel inevitable. Markets continued, courts adjourned and reconvened. Marriages occurred on dates that were thought flattering. And somewhere a fishmonger forgave an extra week because the sea is large and fishermen are patient. Time answered to astronomy and also especially to tidy handwriting on a wall. It is a comforting thought that the world once changed by the width of a line, and that people mostly nodded, made a note, and bought their bread on the appropriate morning. Tomorrow will arrive when the calendar allows it, and the calendar, having learned politeness from centuries of practice, will allow it soon enough. You might not expect a city to worry about which way it is facing when it yawns, but Heian-kyo, the old Kyoto, did, gently and continuously, as if the whole capital were a sleeper who preferred not to turn onto the wrong side. In the quiet of evening, a paper talisman sticks to a lintel with a soft tap. Somewhere a small compass needle trembles, and an incense stick makes a slow comma of smoke in a corner you would not otherwise notice. The Onmyōji court diviners of direction do not ring bells. They read the map as though it were a polite letter from the cosmos. They look toward the northeast and call it the Kimin, the Demon's Gate, which sounds like a dramatic door, but behaves more like a draft under the window. Bothersome. Familiar and handled with cloth rather than sword. Streets meet at right angles because the plan decrees it. Doorways slide because wood knows how to apologize. People do not announce that they will avoid an unlucky quarter tonight. They simply tuck their sleeves and choose a different alley, a detour as ordinary as tying sandals. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe or simply let the audio stroll off without you. Either decision is auspicious provided you make it calmly. The maps of the Onmyōji have edges. The city is a grid, the palace a rectangle that pretends to be inevitable, and yet the geomancer's brush marks certain corners as if they were slightly louder than others. The northeast is marked with a neat stroke. Roofs along that line seem to slant a degree shy of what the carpenter intended. A gate is open for air, but closed for alignment. This is not law. It is custom with good posture. Houses learn to feel it. A veranda favors morning sun instead of that particular corner wind. A family shrine migrates the distance of a tatami because an uncle dreamed of a fox that preferred a different room. Everyone knows without saying that there are evenings you do not take the straightest path. Children learn the shape of the rule like they learn the route to water. They watch their elders pause before a crossroads, then turn with the softness that belongs to habit. Night in the capital is a courteous negotiator. When the calendar declares Katatagae, nights of turning aside, even officials discover that the lane they plan to use is a little thinner than they remembered. There is no trumpet. A tea house waiter notes the posted advisory, the way he notes the price of pickles and moves the lantern one hook to the left. Courtiers adjust itineraries. Messengers tie their sandals again and go toward the more helpful direction, which is exactly as eventful as rearranging cushions. Deliveries still arrive. Only the angle changes, which to an Onmyōji is the same thing as destiny choosing a smaller brush. The city's flow obeys a traffic rule written in air. The effect is not fear, but rhythm, the way you and a friend both step to the outside of a puddle without discussing it. Window shutters creak a little earlier in the evening. The market closes with a nod. Somewhere a priest writes very small characters on a very small paper and presses it above a lintel. The way a librarian inserts a bookmark close to the threshold. There are tools that turn the rule into touch. The Ofuda, the paper charm, says more by being thin than a sculpture could say by being heavy. It is pasted to a beam and forgets nothing. The compass, tucked in a sleeve or sat on a polished board, quivers when brought toward the Kimin, like a tiny horse that has learned the smell of a hill it prefers not to climb. Incense makes curls that tilt when it meets the wrong corner, and an old woman who has never read a court manual knows the curl and reads it as weather. She does not cross the threshold that night. She sweeps the step instead and declares it equivalent to travel. The knots and rope tell a story about crossings and pauses. A ceramic dish is turned so that its quiet face meets a different wall. With these 3 or 4 small things, a charm, a needle, a thread, a dish, the house holds a vote and decides not to open that particular door. Monoimi is the art of not doing. On some days, a person sets aside the impulse to begin. Farmers let the spade rest. Merchants decide that shelves can wait. And a messenger who prides himself on punctual steps chooses to take the long way and arrives exactly when he is supposed to, by a method that looks suspiciously like dawdling. A sign at a corner reads like courtesy. Today we admit burdens, not burdens. Today we do not cross that line. Children practice by skipping 1 flagstone 3 times, and adults laugh with a gentleness that says the game understands them, not the other way around. Avoidance becomes the safest motion, a discipline disguised as patience. In another century, a productivity manual will call this time blocking, but the Onmyōji had already filed it under relief. Markets adapt with the efficiency of water. Inns along the clean detour fill with travelers who would rather obey than boast. A stall slides half a pace to the luckier side of a lane, and in that half pace the arithmetic of scarcity and plenty is negotiated. Caravans arrive later but cleaner. The ledger calls it adversity avoided, which is very good for margins. You can imagine a fishmonger deciding that tonight the salmon prefers the southeast route and revising his prices by exactly 1 knot in the rope that binds the basket. The money learns the path as quickly as the feet. Direction functions like a tax you cannot resent, rarely argued and regularly paid. The notice is small, the compliance large. Tellers stamp receipts with a tiny fox in the corner. A private joke that suggests luck has an office, even authority bows to corners. A daimyo's column moves with pomp, but the road bends it anyway. Lodging shifts, the grand gate is sidestepped by a side door, and the soldiers who may not know a compass from a ladle learn the grace of curves. The crowd understands this as consideration. The heavens read it as compliance. The strength of a city is measured by how smoothly it turns on its axis without snapping its pace. Like a dancer who keeps the sleeve wide and the foot precise. What bends is not the road as much as the intention that walks it. The magistrate who once arrived first learns the serenity of arriving second on a more favorable wind. A courier discovers that a longer line can be a shorter task if it keeps him in the cheerful quarter of town where people win pens. Certain places remember the rule, even when the rule sleeps. The temple precinct with its evergreen corners keeps the sentence of an edict long banished, the corner that does not move. Plots are replanned and streets resurfaced if that wedge on the map stays empty and powerful as a paused breath. The absence is not dramatic. It is comfortable, like leaving a space on the shelf for the book your aunt will eventually lend back. Intersections are repaved, and the line where the incense once curled is paved again, but the curl survives in memory. Shops nearby learn to turn their signs not exactly to the street, but slightly inward, the angle of courtesy that avoids being rude to a rule. You can still hear it under modern air conditioners. Ask a taxi driver the quickest way, and he will glance down a street, then choose the next one. Not because the first is blocked, but because tonight is facing the wrong story. It is unfashionable to admit this aloud. We are meant to be brave in straight lines. Yet even neighborhoods that hung new signs and new wiring keep one corner that sleepy brains cross with a second thought. Office workers arrange desks to face just so. Apartment hunters open the balcony door and say, as if tasting tea, better from here. There are regulations about traffic, and there are preferences about wind that never meet at city. Halt but negotiate every evening in the kitchens. A modern calendar cannot list Katatagae without smiling, but the habit hides in other phrasing. We call it last train, and final call, and the corridor is under maintenance, and the effect is identical. A long route becomes correct by custom rather than command. Delivery apps plot the detours automatically. Someone has told the algorithm that a certain alley is best left alone after dusk, and the code obeys without asking which fox wrote it. People post pictures of paper charms they found above old shop doors and treat them as design rather than instructions, but they still pass under them with the softness of step that happens when you walk under a memory. The quiet economy of direction runs on small agreements. We will pretend that north is a polite guest, that southeast is a pleasant afterthought, that tonight the corner shrine prefers a little less company. In return, the city offers smoother errands, unremarkable arrivals, and the gentle prestige of having followed instructions that no one had to shout. In a loud world, such obedience is restful. You bring home a new broom and discover by accident that the east wall is a nicer place to lean in. You choose a seat by the window that faces away from nothing in particular. Your tea cools at the correct pace because this is the corner where steam behaves. If someone wants to keep score, and a city always does look at the ledger, carts that choose the clean path produce fewer broken pots. Inns at advantageous corners accumulate the sort of reputation that smells like simmering soup and prudent choices. Money likes curves if they are justified. Direction becomes interest paid to good sense. Even the gossip reflects it. People know that a certain marriage prospered because the couple took the long way after the ceremony, or that a shop survived because it refused to face the corner that launched rumors. The humor remains dry. A clerk claims that the office printer jams more often when it points northwest, and the office nods and rotates it to the southeast, after which it jams with a better attitude. The Onmyōji of old would have recognized the modern decision tree. The diviner's board has become a spreadsheet with conditional formatting. The incense curls a bar chart that leans. What remains is the art of small avoidance, the clean pleasure of stepping aside without surrendering destination. It is not mystical. It is ergonomic. One could force the motion through the unlucky gate and accumulate a story about how nothing went wrong. Exactly. Or one could turn and accumulate an afternoon with fewer explanations. It is the same effort as choosing the pillow that keeps your neck from writing letters of complaint in the morning. At home, the implements of the softband are ordinary household members. The afuda lives near the door not as defense, but as punctuation. The way you place a period at the end of a sentence and feel complete. A small compass peeks from a drawer and returns to sleep after verifying that the bed does not lie directly in line with the stairwell's gust. The incense burns less for scent than for the way smoke prefers one corner to another. On a day of Monnoimi, you do light chores and call it holy. Rice soaks a little longer. The broom waits for a more helpful wind. Emails are answered with admirable brevity. The rule is not against action, only against insisting on it. The house approves, and the floorboards stop creaking in that accusing way. There is a tenderness to a rule everyone knows and no one enforces. A city inherits the memory of angles like a family inherits a recipe for soup and then keeps adjusting it to current vegetables. The demon gate shrinks to something domestic, a draft that makes tea cool too quickly, a glare that encourages plants to sulk, a curb that tricks bicycles into a bump. People treat these irritations with respect older than the lamps. They turn aside. Their nights are ordinary and therefore good. The result, when you step back, is a map more lived in than drawn. The forbidden quarter is not dangerous. It is merely less convenient, like a jacket pocket that eats coins. The open till appears where the detour delivers more cheerful feet. A daimyo's ceremonial turn becomes a commuter's small preference. The corner that does not move remains useful, less as law than as reminder that the city is a book written by many hands, and that certain pages resist editing in ways you come to appreciate. You may, at this hour, be half asleep, and that is appropriate. The entire practice is an argument for drowsy competence. Do not push harder than the wind. Avoid the angle that frowns. Remember that even a powerful march can spare a few steps for an auspicious bend. In the morning, you will take the route you always take and avoid the one you never choose. And you will call it efficiency, which it is. Somewhere a paper charm will hang loose at the corner, and someone without instructions will smooth it and pat the lintel as if praising a child who has behaved through a long ceremony. One last small picture for your pillow, an alley at dusk, quiet as a sleeve. The incense thread fades into the darker air. A cat, who knows nothing of edicts, chooses the friendlier wall and pretends the decision was his idea. A cyclist dismounts politely, turns into the clean lane, and arrives without fanfare at noodles that steam in the calm light. The Onmyōji would approve of the noodles, the turn, and the absence of drama. The city shrugs its shoulders into the good direction. You can too now, without getting up. You might not expect a city to keep a sacred cupboard for sticks, but many did, and not only cities. Abbeys and harbors and polite little market squares all owned rods with grander resums than most nobles. They were not magical. They were plain. An ell in walnut, a yard in iron, a bushel ring in beaten bronze, and a set of weights shaped like onions that nestled one inside the other, as if the smallest weight napped in the biggest one's pocket. The cupboard had a key. The key had a keeper. The keeper had a bench and a ledger and the comforting authority of someone whose job is to say, "No, that's not a yard," and somewhere a stallholder sighed and shaved a thumb's width off a bolt of cloth. The whole economy of distance and flour and fish practiced its scales like a student, daily without applause. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the measurements rock you to sleep. Both choices weigh about the same, provided the scale has been checked. The office of the owl did not look like power, which was half its charm. In Bruges, a brass bar was pinned to a wall. In Nuremberg, a yard was carved into stone. In a dozen ports from the Baltic to the Bay of Biscay, grommets and rings along a quay told you how deep a barrel should look when honest wine sat inside. In England, the Winchester bushel was a circle you could step into, an odd sort of halo. In France, the toys stretched with dignity, while in Scotland, the ell took on a taller personality and refused to match its English cousin. Everyone agreed that order was important. No one agreed how long it should be. A King Henry I, the story goes, offered the neat solution of a personal yard from nose to thumb, which is exactly as scientific as it sounds and still managed to calm people for a while. It is pleasant to imagine clerks leaning forward, trying discreetly to see the royal thumb without. Staring at the royal nose. Market morning has a tempo set by the clatter of weights. A cloth merchant unrolls a bolt with a ceremonial flick of someone presenting a banner. The inspector called an honor in Paris. Almager in England drops a stiff measuring rod across the warp and says, gently, that the rod owes the merchant 1 more inch. A baker's loaf is lifted, weighed against a polished stone or a brass weight the size of a small pear, and returned to the counter with the kind of nod that means both. This is acceptable, and do not get clever. The baker smiles, with the particular radiance of a person who knows he has added water to the dough on damp days, as tradition allows, and that the assize of bread lists more exceptions than rules. The city is calm when the weights are calm. A fishmonger who has filed a sliver off a weight watches the inspector's sleeve, which is where the inspector keeps a tiny nested set of test weights like secret teacups. The sleeve decides whether the fishmonger's day will end early. There is a mild absurdity to how much of history is about very small amounts of cheating. A scale tilts a degree. A measure ring leans on the barrel. A yardstick acquires a friendly shaving at one end. A grocer piles chickpeas into a pyramid that seems to disobey physics, but in fact obeys patience. Cities, like careful parents, respond by fastening standards to walls where everyone can see them. Here, they say, is the foot. People who have never met and never will agree to pretend this brass is the truth. It works. It mostly works. Children measure each other against the bar like medieval growth charts. Sailors sing about fathoms and never ask whose outstretched arms donated the original. The magic, if there is any, lies not in the metal but in the unanimous shrug. Verification is a ritual without incense but with the same slow grace. On St. Monday, when workshops mysteriously work less, the guilds might schedule the proving of weights. The inspector sets the official pound on the left pan. One by one, the shopkeepers bring theirs. Some are handsome bells with handles. Some are humble lumps that look as though a child shaped them and the smith apologized. A dishonest weight hopes to be mistaken for quaintness. The inspector does not oblige. He listens to the click of the pans as a piano tuner listens to a note. The ledger receives remarks like shaved at bottom and chandelier fashioned. Acceptable, which is the sort of phrase anyone would be pleased to hear about themselves. Where cloth is involved, the seeing improves. An alnager's rod is stiff and notched, sometimes with little brass studs that wink as if proud of their arithmetic. The merchant spreads wool and holds his breath while the rod makes its polite descent. A tiny wooden wedge, the nail, slides along to mark fractions. This is measurement as conversation, a question asked, an answer implied, a compromise reached about a quarter nail that might have wandered. The rod is not a weapon. It is simply a referee with varnish. At fairs, traveling measurers carry folded rods like umbrellas that never open, and they gain respect the way umbrellas do, by being present when it rains. The scale is the star in apothecary shops. It is precise like a gossip and twice as sensitive. Powdered rhubarb, ground pearls, and things better left unnamed balance against drams and scruples with a drama too small to see. A breeze walks in with a customer and tilts the verdict. The pharmacist's conscience joins the contest and adds invisible mass of its own. The scale flirts with equilibrium, then settles. A legend rises later that this moment cured someone, or at least persuaded them to pay. The waits return to their little velvet beds and sleep with the confidence of minor nobility. Once a town trusts its measures, those measures develop appetites. The assize of bread links loaf weight to the price of grain, and bakers become accidental economists. The law does not want to ruin them. It wants to standardize a type of fairness a hungry crowd can live with. Bakers post tables next to their ovens. When wheat costs this, a penny buys that. People read the table the way we read weather apps, hopefully, and with a known degree of disappointment. Butter, which resists standardization by changing its mind with temperature, is weighed in dishes that pretend not to notice. Someone invents the smear allowance, which is the official term for the mess left on the knife. You can fall asleep just pronouncing it. Cloth taxes ownage turn fabric into arithmetic. A country that would prefer to tax walls and windows because they cannot run away also taxes the width of wool, which certainly tries. Broadcloth pays one rate, narrow cloth another. Towns learn to stretch or relax their looms just enough to live in the more charming bracket. The onager's seal impressed in lid and attached by a thread works like a passport. A bolt of wool without a seal is technically naked. The market asks it to dress properly before showing itself. The system is simple until regional units put on their local hats. An L is 45 inches in one place and 37 in another, and carriers discover the art of selling at the border where a yard politely expands by law. This is not smuggling. This is mathematics with luggage dot weights, and measures become city pride. Florence and Venice polish their standards until they gleam like statements. Our pound, the city implies, is an honest pound that attracts trade like lavender attracts bees. A town famous for cheating may be famous only once. Travelers' guides list the conversions in cramped columns, so many L's to a toys. So many Paris feet to a Rhineland shoe, and apprentices memorize them with the same vacant heroism with which we memorize Wi-Fi passwords. In a world without universal units, the universal language is bargaining. The phrase, as measured in the market, floats like a solvent through disputes and dissolves most of them. When officials are stern, measurement becomes theater. An inspector tips a barrel to see if the wine kisses the iron of the official dipstick exactly where last week's meeting agreed it should. It does not. The cellarer blames evaporation, angels, or the bold curvature of the barrel, which seems an overachiever. The crowd mumbles. The inspector taps the stave with the stick in a way that says the stick has opinions. A fine is written in a hand so tidy even the guilty admire it. Later, this same cellarer will present a cup to the inspector and say, with saintly resignation, taste its accuracy. Wine proves surprisingly persuasive. There are micro-hooks in this story that look like jokes and are in fact regulation. In some towns, a measure for salt is kept larger because salt is damp and sulks in the corners. In others, firewood is measured facing north to avoid cooperative breezes. Rapeseed is leveled with a flat ruler. Peas may be heaped like a modest hill. Oats are treated with a compassion bordering on favoritism. A world without spreadsheets express fairness with little wooden habits. A spoon for honey is wiped with one swipe and no more. A bar of soap is not weighed with a string attached. The inspector's patience is long, his pencil short, and then quietly, the measures become weapon-soft ones like pillows thrown of principle. A town that raises its pound by a whisper becomes suddenly richer when taxes are counted in that pound. A duke who announces that his bushel is generous finds his granaries strangely nourished. The conversation about justice turns into a book about definitions. People argue without raising voices over whether a barrel is tall and narrow or short and pleased with itself. In marketplaces with more than one sovereign in shouting distance, a merchant may display two sets of weights like bilingual dictionaries. Trade runs on code switching. Everyone is fluent. A spectacularly calm revolution arrives with metrology, the metric system, which does not so much argue as exhale. The meter is not a thumb. It is a fraction of the earth, which seems at once poetic and too large to complain. The kilogram has no opinion about weather. The letter, unromantic and dignified, sits on a shelf and waits for nations to adopt it, which they do slowly, the way people warm to sensible shoes. Museums inherit the older standards and arrange them in glass like a miniature army of ex-officials. Visitors stare at iron elwins and nesting weights and experience the same nostalgia you feel for a map that still shows dragons. Outside, the grocery sells milk by the liter and strawberries by the 250-gram punnet. Inside, the brass yard remembers applause. Not everything evaporates. The phrases remain. We still speak of rule of thumb, even when thumbs have been demoted. We call someone level-headed and mean that their internal pan has settled. We speak of giving someone an inch and watching them take a mile, which is a conversion problem disguised as a proverb. In markets, scales still gather stories a customer places a bundle on the pan and notices with satisfaction that the needle behaves like a polite guest. At home, bathroom scales go on trial on Mondays. Verdicts are appealed to Tuesdays. The old assurance survives. That quantity is not a mood. If you wander European old towns with soft eyes, you can still find the measures exactly where they always lived, on walls near the square. In the shadow of a belfry at the entrance to a guild hall, a child is lifted to stand inside the bushel ring making a photograph that confuses his future sense of volume. Newlyweds measure each other against the yard and agree, with profound scientific rigor, that nothing important depends on the last quarter inch. A tour guide points to an iron hook and says that official ropes, once hung there on market days to prove that a hundredweight was a hundredweight, and neither apologetic nor ambitious. There is pleasure in hell. Unnecessary most of the drama always was. No war is decided by the exact width of a Flemish L, yet the hum of fairness threaded through the centuries like the string through a set of nested weights, holding them together even when no one was looking. You could, if you liked, bring a tiny scale to a friend's house and weigh the slices of cake to ensure equity. Your friend would roll their eyes and cut the bigger slice for you anyway, because social life is a system more generous than law. Meanwhile, in the quiet office by the cupboard, the keeper still has work. He checks the keys. He opens the door. He regards the rods and rings with the satisfaction that belongs to objects that remain useful by being boring. The ledger records that on a damp Thursday, the brass bushel needed drying with a cloth, that a baker's balance was reset by the thickness of a fingernail, that a closer's habit of rounding down was corrected by conversation and a cup of ale. The keeper closes the door. The city continues to buy and sell without noticing how sleepy trust feels. If you listen, measurements have their own bedtime sounds. A weight settling in a pan is the sigh of a day that now makes sense. A yardstick tapping a tabletop is the kind of woodpecker that reassures rather than interrupts. The scratch of a pencil shows tiny mountains of numbers marching politely left to right. Somewhere a merchant calls out, "Make it a full pint," which is not a threat, but a wish for the world to be round enough. The wish is often granted. Not always, but often enough to sleep. Toward the end of the evening, after shutters fall and the square collects its last stray echoes, the brass L on the wall goes on measuring nothing with perfect accuracy. Moonlight touches it and keeps no record. A cat passes under the bushel ring without converting. A barrel at the back of a tavern expands minutely because wood listens to night air. Someone has left a dipstick leaning nearby, and tomorrow it will confirm that nothing essential has changed. The standards nap like responsible grandparents, certain that in the morning human beings will resume the ancient sport of agreeing about how much is how much. And you, if your eyelids have reached their own honest equilibrium, might consider that the loveliest thing a scale ever says is not equal, but quiet. The pans stop moving. The needle stands between. The keeper locks his cupboard and carries the key as if it weighed exactly what a key should. The city sleeps in units, which is a very stable kind of dream. You might not think a city could have a wrong direction, the way a sock has a wrong side, but medieval Kyoto politely disagreed. If you stood under the night lamps and pointed toward the Demon Gate northeast, the angle where shadows felt a little too awake, the elders of direction would cough into their sleeves and suggest another route. This was not superstition in the explosive sense, the dramatic kind with booming drums and last-minute rescues. It was the softer variety, careful, bureaucratic, and written on paper in a hand so neat you'd trust it with your laundry. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe to hear more such gentle detours, or you can let the ideas wander on without you and drift off. Either way, no one will check which direction you face. Cities breathe in corners. Kyoto's breath moved around a particular Wenkemen, the Demon Gate, a polite euphemism for the place northeast where calamity was rumored to enter as if paying a visit. Every wall and watercourse, every roof, ridge, and alley had a temperament that could be nudged by angle alone. It is not a fierce belief. It is more like the habit of turning a teacup so the crack does not meet your lip. Shrines leaned against the problem, the way you lean on a railing to be sure of it. There was a small shrine set exactly where a problem corner required one. and another shrine further out like a spare umbrella. Families arranged their houses so that a crucial doorway did not glare toward the unlucky edge. If it already glared, the house learned to squint. A screen, a hedge, a gate that looked slightly aside like an embarrassed dog. Windows narrowed into courtesy. Roof eaves tilted in small negotiations with the sky. The effect was quiet, like changing a sentence from I must to I should and feeling better. The Onmyōji, the technicians of yin and yang, calendar and compass did not scold. They recommended. A street running into the demon gate might be soft with a new bend. A well mouth would prefer to face a truer calm. A gate asked to stand guard overnight would do so with an extra charm tucked into its joinery. The measures of this order were chalk marks, paper talismans, and the patient language of alignment. They mapped calamity the way a librarian maps noise, not to ban it, only to shelve it properly. If you've ever moved your bed a handspan and slept better, you have already passed the entrance exam to this old profession. On certain evenings, the habit became official. The calendar had nights when travel was discouraged, the city's mood turning like a fish in shallow water so that its scales lay against the light differently. People did not treat these nights as prisons, only as suggestions from a friend who knows the weather. Deliveries waited. Appointments strolled to the next day. Tea houses murmured that the Northeast was not accepting visitors and brewed for the West instead. A messenger with a stiff deadline learned a new route and added 5 minutes to the story he would boast about later. If he still went anyway, he might do it with a talisman tucked under his belt or a brief stop at a shrine, whose job description included smoothing the angles. The rule said, turn aside, and everyone translated it as always. To be sensible. The gate where misfortune was said to enter was not a gate in the architectural sense. No lintel or hinge, only a slice of air in a particular direction. Cities respect imaginary things when enough people agree to look at them. Maps in the Onmyōji's office bore careful ink lines like musical staves. On one sheet, the northeast was shaded as if a cloud leaned there. On another, the city's square was set slightly askew so that mischief slid off it the way rain slides off oiled paper. On certain mornings, the compass needle trembled, or maybe someone only remembered it trembling, which is often enough. Markets, with their pragmatic arithmetic, sent their own needle. Prices inched sideways when traffic avoided a quarter. The city absorbed it with that tolerant shrug cities have built into their shoulders. The tools of a soft band do not look important when they are asleep. An Ofuda paper printed with a divine name is light enough to forget you are holding it until a breeze explains. A little compass with a nervous needle waits for a fingertip on its lid. A stick of incense curls smoke resembling the handwriting of a thoughtful cat. Its job is to mark the air, not perfumed but visible, the way chalk marks the idea of a circle. A brush writes the talisman, and then the brush is washed and propped in a jar where it leans, exhausted by courtesy. The articles are modest. The effect is procedural. A threshold hung with a strip of paper does not bar the body. It bars the part of you that wanted to do one foolish thing quickly. Even the day has duties. In the old calendar, some dates were marked for monami, a day of withholding. Not a fast, exactly, but a pause that leaned over from the calendar and pressed one finger to your schedule. You did not begin a journey. You preferred not to cross someone else's threshold because their holds on such days were considered quarrelsome. Shops still sold soap and rice. The city did not collapse, but everyone's pace wanted to match the incense thread's unhurried climb. The notices were flimsy small wooden tags, a line in a list, yet the city's feet obeyed the scribble. Children were told twice, then again after sweet. Adults nodded as if to say they had intended to rest anyway. The language of the day had soft syllables. Avoidance, practiced often enough, becomes a discipline. The most efficient rule is not shouted but remembered. In the North Quarter, An inn with a bright lantern quietly moved its brightest table to the southwest corner on certain nights. A tea house that would not serve an auspicious direction simply turned its mat seating so that conversation flowed away from the difficult angle, like water around a stubborn stone. No one suffered. People obeyed with the laziness of contentment. A ledger noted with unfussy pen strokes that revenues did not fall, they simply leaned. A visitor asked why a gate was closed and was handed tea, which is both an answer and a delay. The Onmyōji's office recorded such things in the same way a gardener records a plant's preferred patch of shade. Meanwhile, the compass kept quivering, either from geomancy or from gossip. Direction shapes money as easily as it shapes footsteps. Inns along the safe detour prospered on Katatagae nights, and their owners, who liked a little moral geometry, donated to the very shrines that made detours fashionable. A street along the unlucky compass line also thrived on ordinary days, when people made up for yesterday's restraint with today's errands. The city's economy learned to breathe with these small contractions and relaxations. The phrase "Forbidden's Quarter" never meant closed, only complicated. The way out-of-office emails never mean no work is happening, only that it is happening elsewhere with more cushions. Merchants adapted by making honesty look like a good idea they had first. A carpenter tidily rotated his woodpile so the fresh cedar faced the calm direction, arguing with cheerful pragmatism that dry boards are less haunted by warping. A cloth dealer reoriented bolts of silk, not because demons cared about weft, but because customers standing in favorable light buy more. The ledgers approved. People like to believe that their obedience to small rules pays interest, and when the innkeeper's box clinked on the quiet night, it confirmed the theory. Accounts developed an accent of Northeast and Southwest, like a dialect that only the cash drawer spoke. Prohibitions have a way of teaching detours how to count. A daimyo, traveling with attendants whose job description included measuring respect with distance, would sometimes honor the rule and take the long way. The long way acquired inns whose pillows were said to remember the heads of courtiers. Roadside tea stands trained their kettles to boil 1 minute sooner. A coastal road learned to bend in a new place, the bend becoming a proverb, the Lord's Corner, which meant, roughly, that dignity can curve without breaking. The procession's banners streamed as if the wind had also read the calendar. A child watching from the ditch remembered forever that the Lord's horse had turned as if it liked manners. Markets discovered that direction can be a price. Stalls near the honorably quiet lane charged a whisper more for fish on Katatagae nights, and a whisper is a coin no one resents paying. Caravans adjusted loads so that the heavy crates rode on the side of the cart that would not test the unlucky gutter's patience. The city solved problems with a logic rubbery enough to stretch, but tight enough to snap back into shape. There is a specialty in every age for people who manage detours: the coordinator, the scheduler, the friend who knows an owie. In Kyoto's administrative poetry, they were called exactly what they were not: infringers, transgressors, breakers. They broke nothing. They escorted the city around itself. Sometimes the calm produced comedy so understated you could nap while it happened. A fortune teller asked to bless a new storefront glanced up at the ridgeline, hummed approvingly, and then moved the cash box 3 finger widths to the right. The owner swore afterward that he had slept better since. A woman suspicious of the Northeast kept a travel diary that carefully listed every inn's bath door orientation, and the diary won a small readership among people who quietly preferred steaming in a favorable direction. A carpenter cut a lintel that dog-legged in the middle like an elbowed noodle and announced, "Now nothing walks straight in." His apprentice, sweeping, muttered that misfortune probably could turn corners too, but he swept away from the demon gate just the same. What lingers is not the ban, but the way streets learn to breathe around it. A lane that once kinked to dodge the unlucky angles stayed kinked after the reason retired. The bend saved a cherry tree. The cherry tree became the landmark. Lovers met there. A sweet shop opened nearby. The proprietor boasted, truthfully, that misfortune never walked straight into his door because no one did. If anyone asked why, the shopkeeper said, through bean paste steam, that the city had once preferred to look slightly aside in that direction. The phrase is comfortable, slightly aside. It describes half of etiquette and most of urban planning. Modern cities inherit just enough of this whisper to amuse their traffic engineers. A condominium lobby on a certain street places its potted pine at the left of the door instead of the right, and the sales brochure does not mention why, but the contractor smiles as if someone's grandmother won a small argument. An office tower aligns its atrium to a grid you cannot see, and somewhere a consultant's slide deck used the old words without italics. A family buys an apartment and rearranges the sofa with brisk purpose. They are not avoiding a demon, only an uncomfortable draft that has the same address. The compass on a phone locks politely to cardinal points. A shrine app reminds you to turn your car around before you go home, which is old advice disguised as traffic dot, and neophytes still travel, folded in wallets, taped inside cupboard doors, tucked into luggage like a passport for luck. Incense smoke continues to rise at the speed of patience. A brush writes characters on New Year's Day, and the wet ink glows like proper intention. Those who do not believe in direction still avoid the stop sign of a certain corner, because everybody else slows their custom has more gravity than doctrine. Not that way, someone says out of habit, and no one bothers to ask why. The habit is the answer, and it is surprisingly restful. If you listen very late when the city no longer pretends to be awake, you can hear the tiny noises of orientation. A gate latch nudges closed with a sound like courtesy. A paper charm flutters against a beam and then lies down, having finished its shift. A messenger reroutes himself one block without resentment because he has always rooted himself that way on nights like this. A map pinned on a scholar's wall shows subtle scars where a compass needle once pressed too hard. The city's quiet corner holds still, exactly as a corner should, not menacing but aware. Not a rumor but a preference. None of it is urgent. The Onmyōji kept ledgers and made recommendations. They were the city's ergonomists, rearranging the furniture of streets so shoulders would not ache later. Their art looked grand in festivals and very small on Tuesdays. They carried compasses like pocket watches and folded their afuda like letters to the geometry of things. You could live your whole life ignoring them and mostly be fine. But just as you sometimes tilt your book to catch better lamplight, the city sometimes shifted a gate, lowered a lantern, or walked around a difficult evening. It is not sensational. It is sanitation for luck. The demon gate is not a demon. It is a reminder that places have habits. Northeasts get reputations. Courtyards learn to listen. Doors develop social lives. If the old rules seem quaint, consider how often you step to one side of a ladder even if you're alone, or how often you walk around a puddle that would take less time to cross. These are our Katatagae small detours that keep dignity dry. The better we get at them, the more invisible they become, like good mending in a cloth. Cities love that sort of repair dot. When sleep reaches you, you might notice your bed faces in the direction you didn't choose. Houses make these choices for us. The wall, the street, the tiny opinion the window has about dawn. These compose the angle of our rest. A charm above the lintel, a plant in the lucky corner, the soft rule not to place a mirror where it will reflect the hallway's rush. These are mild negotiations with habit. If you are not awake to think about them, that is fine. The city will turn slightly aside on your behalf. The compass will tremble, settle, and then keep its opinion to itself. The incense thread will climb like a sleepy line on a page and erase nothing dot, and in the last moment before you drift, consider this not quite rule that outlived its stewards. Turn a little, spare a corner, go gently by the long way when the night asks. The measure of distance is not always yards, but trouble avoided. The measure of safety is not gates closed, but gates often. Somewhere a paper talisman rustles in the draft, and a door decides to open toward the west. And footsteps divert without noticing how wise they look, very nearly missing the demon gate by a comfortable hand's breadth.